name's Danielle DiPietro. I'm a patient advocate at the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com. Today, we're launching our first podcast, After Exposure, Asbestos and Mesothelioma Stories. As part of this podcast, we'll talk about extraordinary stories behind asbestos exposure, chat with doctors, legal experts, and survivors about their perspectives on asbestos and mesothelioma, and discuss other hot topics in the mesothelioma community and the public at large. We're kicking off our podcast with a multi-episode series on Johnson & Johnson, specifically chatting about the legal issues of its iconic Johnson's baby powder. Families use the product on babies, and men and women used it for personal hygiene. Additionally, women use talc-based products as part of their makeup routines throughout their lives. But thousands of people across the United States and the UK are now suing J&J, claiming it caused their mesothelioma or ovarian cancer. My guest today is Whitney Di Bona. Whitney is an attorney and consumer safety advocate with extensive experience representing people harmed by dangerous and defective products. Today, we're breaking down how this happened with Johnson & Johnson baby powder. So what is talc? So talc's a soft mineral. It's a natural mineral, and it's used to absorb moisture and reduce friction. So a lot of people used it for sport purposes. They used it on their baby. People got out of the shower and put it all over their body. So if you were sweating, it would prevent you from having a rash. Same for babies. So it's a natural occurring mineral, and people really use it all over their body. And talc was in cosmetics, deodorants, a lot of consumer products. I mean, today we're really going to focus on Johnson & Johnson and mainly on baby powder, but talc was used in a lot of different loose powder products throughout the years. So overall, though, talc by itself isn't what is dangerous. So that mineral on its own isn't the issue of what we're talking about. The problem is that it's mined next to where asbestos is mined, so they get cross-contaminated. So the fibers, when you mine for talc and asbestos, they're near each other in the earth, and so the fibers from asbestos get into the talc. So when a company like Johnson & Johnson is sourcing for their talc, the asbestos fibers are getting into the talc that they're using to produce their products. So it's pretty much impossible to separate the two, and that's the issue as to why people are getting sick. So some statistics to keep in mind is that there are different types of talc. You have industrial talc and cosmetic talc, and what's making people sick is the cosmetic talc. So industrial talc can contain anywhere from 50 to 70% asbestos, where the cosmetic talcs can contain 0 to 30% asbestos. And what this is causing is mesothelioma cancer, ovarian cancer, different pulmonary diseases. So all talc-based products can potentially put people at risks of these different diseases. And Whitney can dive a little bit deeper into how these exposures happen and what they cause for people today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always excited to talk about this topic. It's something that I'm really passionate about. Because I represented a lot of clients who were exposed to asbestos through talcum powder in their cosmetic products, and they had absolutely no idea that this was even a possibility. So when we're talking about cosmetic products, the way that people will be exposed to asbestos is really from breathing in asbestos fibers. And so when we're talking about cosmetic products, these are going to be in powder form. And whether that's baby powder, like in the case of Johnson & Johnson, and even with some makeup products, anything where you are putting powder any place where you are putting powder into the air and then you are breathing in that powder, you have the potential to be, inhaling thousands and thousands and thousands of asbestos fibers. And what happens when you breathe in the asbestos fibers is that they kind of go down into your body and they will embed themselves in the lining of different organs in your body. Typically, mesothelioma is seen in the lining of the lungs, but it can develop in the lining of other organs. So over time, what happens is, these fibers, these asbestos fibers that are microscopic, they're so tiny, In just the small little tip of my pinky finger, there could be potentially up to 1 trillion asbestos fibers in this tiny little space. So, even just minor exposure from something like a loose face powder or something like that, if you're using that product every single day over decades, you really have to think about, if those products are contaminated with asbestos, how much asbestos you're potentially breathing in on a daily basis through the use of those products. And this is particularly true when we're talking about baby powder, because most of the clients that I've represented used baby powder. They used so much baby powder, and it started basically from birth. Usually their moms would use the baby powder on them. And then it was really kind of almost like a cultural or family ritual where, I've had female clients who talked about being a little girl and they remember their mom teaching them, when you get out of the shower, this is just kind of part of your everyday routine. You're going to put the powder in your hair. You're going to put it on your body. It was just sort of a part of life for so many people. And they tended to continue with that ritual throughout their life. So you're talking about using these powders multiple times a day, sometimes over the course of your entire life. You have to really think about how much potential asbestos you're exposing yourself to in these products. And so, the real harm doesn't happen overnight. The asbestos fibers, like I mentioned, they kind of go down and embed themselves into your body. And once they're in there, you can't really get them out. There's actually a test that they can perform on a human lung or a human organ after someone has passed away, where they basically burn the organ and the tissue, and those asbestos fibers will still be left behind because they're virtually indestructible. And so, when you're talking about using this powder, over decades of time, you're just really exposing yourself to a lot of asbestos. And then what happens is it over time slowly causes inflammation in the lining of those organs. And then it can ultimately develop into mesothelioma or other cancers.
So now we know exactly how many fibers are in asbestos, how many asbestos fibers are in these different loose cosmetic powders and baby powders, and how much exposure one can have from just one use. And the real question now is, what did Johnson & Johnson know, and why did they hide it? And how far back does this history go with them? So as far as what we know today and what court documents have shown, this goes as far back as the 1930s. And that's when Johnson & Johnson, they knew that asbestos can be in the talc that they were using. So they knew this. They were a member of the National Safety Council, and they were aware that their talc could contain asbestos. And so that started around the 1930s. And then, decades later, you talk about the 60s and 70s. And during that time frame, they were trying to remove it. They did different techniques. They would try to float it out. They would try to burn it out, try to grind it out. And they would continue to test their talc, and it still wasn't removed. They hired outside companies to test it, still wasn't removed. And then, in the later part of the 60s, even though it wasn't removed, then internally they were hiding these documents. They would tell people to destroy the documents. They weren't informing the public. They weren't reporting this to the FDA. So all this stuff is going on internally. The public is not made aware of it. But Johnson & Johnson knows, and this has been shown today through different court documents that I'm sure you can touch on that, Whitney, from what you've learned over the years representing clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what sort of outrages people the most is when they find out this long history of what the company knew and how long they knew about these things. And the fact that, instead of informing the public that their products could, potentially be contaminated with asbestos, or using some kind of a warning label, or, they could have just found a way to make the product safer by maybe removing the talc in the first place, or by conducting appropriate testing on every batch of the baby powder. There's so many other things that they could have done. And what they chose to do is, like you said, hide internal documents, hide testing. They chose not to let the FDA know that their products were testing positive for asbestos. And, they really did everything that they could to kind of bury this evidence until it became public and they couldn't hide it any longer. And, that really started with the process of all of these lawsuits that have been filed against them. The litigation against Johnson & Johnson has been now going on for a really long time. There's been a lot of hurdles that plaintiffs and their attorneys have had to jump through, trying to bring forward these cases and litigate against this giant company with billions of dollars. It's just really been it's been a long, hard road for a lot of these plaintiffs who have been waiting for justice. And, so many of them still haven't received any type of compensation for their injuries. Unfortunately, a lot of these plaintiffs have passed away from their illnesses. So, it's the families that are now waiting on justice to be served. So it's really sad to see a company that, just hasn't taken any responsibility. And in fact, they still continue to claim that their products are safe. They still try and say that all of these lawsuits are frivolous and, that they're these giant jury verdicts that are being awarded against them. They're calling them egregious and unconstitutional, and saying that, they're based on junk science, when in reality, you have juries that are hearing this evidence about what the company knew and what they hid, and they're awarding millions and millions and millions of dollars in not only compensatory damages, but punitive damages, which means we're punishing you, Johnson & Johnson, because you knew, you had all this information and you chose to hide it from the public, and you chose to basically to not do the right thing. So.
Yeah. And I mean, they marketed their product for over 100 years as safe. Use it on your child, use it on yourself. And that's what people did for decades. And really, what is it? They didn't pull it off the shelves until 2020 in the United States.
2020 in the United States. And it wasn't until 2023 when they removed talc from their products worldwide. So, I think people don't understand that talc was still used in their baby powder until just a few years ago. And, that's something that you just kind of sit there and go, wow, you knew this for how many years going back to the 1930s, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when, the baby powder is testing positive for asbestos. And you waited until 2020 when you were basically forced to, remove the talc, I believe, because of all the lawsuits and, all of the litigation and the kind of public outrage against the company. But yeah, they waited a really long time to try and do the right thing.
Right. And the reality is it's from the lawsuits, although they're trying to say it's from misinformation is why they pulled it off, and people don't want to buy it anymore is why they're pulling it off the shelves. There's a decline in sales, but it's because of the light of the media and all these big lawsuits and verdicts that are happening.
Exactly. It's not because of the goodness of their hearts or because they were so concerned about the consumers of their products, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you want to touch on maybe some of the cases and when they started, going back to maybe about like 1999 and some of the lawsuits, and explaining how they've developed into, the almost $1 billion lawsuit that happened in 2025?
Sure. So, the first lawsuit for mesothelioma happened, like you just said, in around 1999. And I think that really kind of opened people's eyes to the fact that mesothelioma was not just something that people who worked on ships or people who worked in construction or worked on cars, I think so often when you hear asbestos or, mesothelioma, you automatically kind of think, oh, that's just something that people used a long time ago. And unless you were in the Navy or something like that, you don't really need to worry about it. And so when Johnson & Johnson, was first sued for mesothelioma caused by their baby powder, I think it really kind of opened a lot of people's eyes, and a lot of people started to question, oh, okay, well, this might actually affect me if, I've used these powders during my life, or use these powders on my children. And so that was kind of the start of the litigation. In 2009, there was actually a lawsuit filed, the first lawsuits that were filed for a potential link between Johnson & Johnson baby powder and ovarian cancer. And so since that case was filed, there are now thousands and thousands of lawsuits that have been filed for women who have developed ovarian cancer from, allegedly the use of Johnson & Johnson baby powder. And just to touch on those cases briefly, going back to sort of what I was saying earlier, when you have people that, it's just sort of ingrained in them from an early age to use these powders, what many people did is they would use the powder, they would apply it after their shower, pretty much all over their body. A lot of people would sort of dump the powder into their underwear just for, to keep them dry and things like that. And so the ovarian cancer lawsuits really stem from that type of use. And so, like I said, there's now thousands and thousands of those lawsuits that are pending. There are still women across the country who are filing those lawsuits. And so there's really just sort of been this long history now of litigation with Johnson & Johnson for these cancer cases. And unfortunately, Johnson & Johnson has now filed for bankruptcy on 3 different occasions. They've been trying to utilize this loophole in the law called the Texas two-step, where basically they create a sort of shell corporation and they assign all of their liabilities to that shell corporation. And then they file for bankruptcy protection. And that's what they've tried to do now multiple times, saying, we don't have the money to fight all of these lawsuits. And so we're going to have to file for bankruptcy protection. And the courts keep throwing these out, saying, Johnson & Johnson, let's be real here. You're a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Mm-hmm. You have the money to fight these lawsuits. You have the money to pay out the victims of these lawsuits. And so we're not really going to let you get away with this. So they have attempted this now, like I said, on 3 different occasions. After the last failed bankruptcy attempt, Johnson & Johnson has now said, all right, well, we're going to take every single one of these cases to trial, and we're going to really fight these cases tooth and nail in the court. And since that decision has been made, there's been a couple of these cases that have gone to trial, and they have received some major, there's been major verdicts handed down across the country from different juries. And most notably, the most recent one that is actually just like a record-breaking verdict was for $966 million. So almost $1 billion verdict against the company. And the majority of that award was in punitive damages, like I talked about earlier.
And that's for one patient, right?
And that's one patient, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're really seeing, these major verdicts that are kind of coming in right now. There's also another major trial pending right now in California. We're kind of watching that to see what the verdict is going to be there. But, it's, and I won't sit here and tell you that every single case has been a win. There have certainly been, some of these talc cases that have gone to trial and against Johnson & Johnson, and the plaintiffs have lost. But right now it seems like, with the few cases that have gone to trial recently, they're kind of on a losing spree right now. So we're going to have to just kind of keep our eyes on that and see what happens. But, the more cases they take to trial, it can play a major role in these cases going forward, because it could really cause them to want to settle with a lot of the plaintiffs that are, that still have cases pending, because they don't want to keep going to one. It costs so much money to go to trial, and then you do all that, you go to trial, and a jury awards $966 million in an award against you. That's got to have
more money. Yeah,
exactly. So that these types of major wins are going to have, I think, a huge impact on the future of this litigation.
And my question, I work with, a lot of patients also, is just, what does it take to prove that? A lot of patients will say, well, how can I show that I used Johnson & Johnson 50 years ago to say that's my exposure?
Yeah, I think this is always a question. Whenever, I would have a new client and with any kind of exposure to asbestos, they're always like, how are we going to prove this? This happened sometimes 50 plus years ago. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can prove that you used a particular product. And I think a lot of people are surprised to know that the main way that this is proved is through just the patient's testimony. Your testimony, you would go under a deposition where you're basically placed under oath, and the attorneys are going to ask you questions about, hey, what did you do your whole life? And what kind of products did you use, and all of those sorts of things. And so your actual testimony of saying, from my earliest memories, I remember that my mom taught me to use Johnson & Johnson baby powder, every time after we took a bath or I took a shower. And that was something that continued throughout my life. And that testimony of you talking about how frequently you use those products, that is evidence that a jury can use in determining, whether or not they think you use the product, and ultimately whether the use of that product caused your disease. There's obviously other ways that we can prove that somebody used a product. Typically, that's going to be if they have old family photos. You would be surprised how many people have photos of them either in their bedroom or the bathroom or wherever, and you'll see like bottles of Johnson & Johnson baby powder kind of sitting on the back of the toilet.
I had a patient who had an old canister in her bathroom sink, which was enough for her case. So yeah, to your point of photos. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you have photos, some people even have old bottles of products that they might still have in a cabinet or a bathroom or something like that. So, that type of evidence. Also, you can bring in evidence from other people, and it might just be testimonial evidence, but maybe you have a brother or sister that grew up in the same home as you that can say, yeah, our mom, was always using powder. It was always powder. So if you have other witnesses that can kind of corroborate your version of how often you used baby powder or whatever product it is that you're talking about. And then, during these depositions, plaintiffs are often asked to describe with really specific detail, what did the baby powder that you used, like, what did it look like? Do you remember what color the cap was? Was it blue? Was it pink? Do you remember if the bottle said anything else? Did you ever read the bottle? So there's a lot of questions that get asked at these depositions, and sometimes the plaintiffs can't answer those questions because honestly, who is sitting there paying that close attention to the details on the bottle of every product that you ever use in your life?
Yeah.
So sometimes the questions that get asked seem a little bit silly, but any details that the clients can remember, obviously that's always going to help their case. But yeah, I would say those are the main ways. And then when we're kind of getting into more recent use of these products, because sometimes you'll have a client who will say, yeah, I use these products during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, like through my whole life. And I've seen in cases where some of the defendants will start asking, okay, well, where did you buy these products from? What stores did you purchase them at? And what we're seeing now is some of these defendants going and trying to pull like subpoena records for, how a lot of the grocery stores now have these loyalty reward programs and things like that. Well, a lot of people don't realize they're tracking every single thing that you purchase, and all of your purchases are kind of being saved somewhere. And so these companies are now sometimes subpoenaing those records to make sure, if you've said you're using this product and that you've still been using it all these years, they might pull those records and check them. So there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of prove that you use these products, but ultimately the main evidence in most of these cases is just going to be the testimony of the plaintiff, because sometimes there just isn't, a bunch of evidence otherwise in terms of pictures or records or
Right.
things like that. So,
Right. And I mean, the other thing, at least I feel, is that there are younger patients, there are more female patients, um, and that exposure is usually tied to talc. I mean, do you find that as well? Are you seeing that?
yeah, absolutely. What was kind of scary when we started to see more and more clients who were younger, a lot of female clients who, these women never worked in a factory. They never worked in any kind of an industrial setting. Some of them, so it is possible to be exposed through asbestos from take-home exposure. So if your dad or your brother or somebody who lived in your home, if they worked in an industrial environment, they could come home with those asbestos fibers on their clothes and kind of bring them into the house. And so that's one way that, you might see someone who didn't personally work in that type of an environment still getting that type of exposure to asbestos. But for a lot of these clients, you have to go through an extensive family history, life history with every single client in these cases. And, so often we're just seeing these women that their father didn't work in a factory either. They didn't work in any kind of an industrial setting, and nobody that they were really exposed to or around did. So, you're looking at those cases going, okay, well, how in the world did this 40-year-old woman get mesothelioma? And the only links in a lot of these cases that we can find is that it was solely through the use of talcum powder products, including Johnson & Johnson baby powder. Shower to shower was a big, product that they made that people really, really loved. And again, just kind of doused themselves in the shower to shower. So yeah, it's scary to see so many younger patients getting diagnosed. And again, people that just don't have any of these typical exposures to products or environments that would have exposed them to asbestos, at least in the way that we, typically
Right. No
think about
occupational
asbestos.
exposure. Yeah, I've had
Exactly.
my youngest patient in the years I've been here. So in the last 14 years, I had a patient that was 14 years old. So
Ugh.
that's the youngest I've had. But we definitely see a handful of 30 and 40-year-olds every year.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, knowing that Johnson & Johnson didn't pull products with talc until 2020 is
Mm-hmm.
quite scary.
Yeah.
And to touch on some of the statistics of talc and the litigation. So in 2020, 11% of cases were reported to have talc exposure. And this comes from the KC ICU filings. So it was about 428 cases had some sort of talc exposure filing. And then you look down the road 4 years later, so into last year's report. So in 2024, that grew to 751 talc filings, which is 19% of all the cases. So that went up 75%. So in 4 years, there's been an increase of 75% in talc filings alone. So this is getting to be a very, very big part of the mesothelioma and lung cancer world at this point.
Yeah, it's scary. And also, just something that I just want to add, because I don't think that enough people realize this, is that yes, I know we're primarily talking about Johnson & Johnson baby powder today, but there are still so many products on the market that are being sold that still contain talc. Like we mentioned earlier, Johnson & Johnson did ultimately remove the talc from their baby powder just a few years ago, and they've replaced it with cornstarch. But there are still tons and tons of products on shelves that contain talc. And if you asked me if I think that they are safe or if I would be using those products, I would say absolutely not. I have basically found a talc-free alternative for everything in my makeup bag, in my bathroom cabinet. You're not going to find talc in there. So I just think that it's important for people to know that talc is not banned. Asbestos, yeah, we're not supposed to have asbestos in products, but these companies aren't intentionally adding in the asbestos. It's just coming in through contamination of the talc, which the talc is perfectly legal. And as of right now, there is no mandatory safety testing. There's no across the board testing for asbestos in talc that is required. This is actually something that the FDA has been considering, and for the past year, I believe they announced in January that they were sort of working on this rule that was supposed to go into effect that would mandate companies to test every batch of any type of cosmetic talc for asbestos. And just, I think it was last week or the week before, they actually just announced that they were pulling that rule. And so right now we're just kind of waiting because they're allegedly going to propose some kind of new rule, but we don't know how long that's going to take. And even with that, there's a lot of question and debate over what type of testing is actually going to detect all of the asbestos in a product. So there's different ways that you can test, and the scientists kind of disagree on what should be the kind of the gold standard for this testing. And so there's a lot of issues there and issues with safety for these talcum powder products. So I think it's really important that people realize, just because it's sold on the shelf, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe or that it is, that it's undergone some kind of safety testing, because right now that is just not the case, especially when it comes to products that contain talc.
Right. And Johnson & Johnson never put any labels on theirs either. I mean, did they even label it that it had talc?
I'm sure on the ingredient list, it would have said talc. But again, nobody knew that talc is just, okay, it's an ingredient. It doesn't say talc that could contain asbestos, or there's no kind of warning on there for people. So they just see talc and think, oh, okay, that's just the ingredient that's in there. So that's sort of the main problem.
So we understand all the different products that are on the shelves today and were decades ago, and what to look for, and reading about talc, and really, as a consumer today and one from decades ago, things to keep in mind if you were a Johnson & Johnson user at any point in your life, whether it was minimal or a heavy user, because, we do know that any amount of exposure can cause someone to develop an asbestos-related disease, whether it be lung disease, lung cancer, mesothelioma. You need to be mindful of symptoms, right? Talk to your doctor. Even if you don't have symptoms today, you can let them know that you do know that you have a history of exposure. Let them make note of that. You can have a lung x-ray done as a baseline. There might be no findings, or you can just keep an eye out for symptoms. If you notice a change in your breathing, you notice tightening in your chest, a persistent cough, if you have drastic weight loss, night sweats, anything along those lines, talk to your doctor. You really should be having an x-ray or a CT scan of your lungs. They can do a pulmonary function test. There is also peritoneal mesothelioma, which is a lot more rare, but affects the abdomen. So, if you notice your abdomen is extended and that never goes away, you could have fluid there. So if you know that you are a user of this product at any point, and there are changes to your body, especially for elderly patients, don't relate shortness of breath to age. Get tested, talk to your doctor, be mindful of this. Mm-hmm. And if something comes of it, if there is a diagnosis, it's very important to seek legal help. These companies should be held accountable. I mean, we went through the history of what these companies knew, especially Johnson & Johnson. I mean, going back to 1930s, it's almost 100 years at this point that they knew, and they're still trying to get out of paying victims that are dying from their product. So, here we have a team of advocates. So both for medical and legal purposes, we can help you navigate that. We can help you find the right attorney that has experience with talc cases, that has litigated some of these large verdicts and things like that. So it's important on both ends medically to be mindful of your body. And if there is a diagnosis, to continue to hold these companies accountable for the future of patients too.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of touch on your point about some of these symptoms not necessarily being associated with mesothelioma. That happens all the time, and it's sometimes really difficult for patients to actually get the diagnosis. Sometimes it takes a long time, or it kind of goes undetected, or they think that it's something else, and then they find out later in time that it's actually mesothelioma. So that's something that we see a lot, just because of how I don't want to scare people. I don't want to be like, if you ever use Johnson & Johnson baby powder in your life, then you should be terrified.
Right.
Because even for me, I'm like, my mom definitely used Johnson & Johnson baby powder on me and all my siblings in the 80s and the 90s. And so it's still a rare, very rare disease. It's a very rare cancer. But it's just something to be mindful of. And like you said, mention it to your doctors. Mention, if you think you had any type of exposure to asbestos in any way, shape, or form, and you're experiencing any of those kinds of symptoms, just mention it to your doctor, because, typically this is a disease that we see in, the older generation. But like we've talked about today, we're seeing patients younger and younger getting diagnosed with this disease. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And 100%, if you are unfortunately diagnosed with this cancer, or anyone who gets diagnosed with this cancer, it's really important to seek legal help early in the game, because there's lots of evidence and things that it needs to get pulled together. And sometimes when you wait longer and longer, that can cause issues. And holding these companies responsible for this type of negligence, this type of cover up for so many of these companies, it's so important. And it really is the men and women who are willing to come forward and fight against these companies that are kind of changing the landscape for everyone else. If it hadn't been for all of these people willing to file lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson and come forward against them, Johnson & Johnson would still be selling baby powder with talc in it. So, as much as people want to sometimes talk badly about lawsuits and, people who bring them, this is really the way that change happens. So if you find yourself in a situation, where you've been harmed by a big corporation like Johnson & Johnson, what we have seen is, the government is not always going to have these regulations in place to protect you, to protect other people. And so it really becomes almost a responsibility of the public. And also, I think with just the media outrage and, people spreading the word about these products, the more that we talk about these things, the more people can stand up against these corporations and make things better for the future.
Yeah, I agree. And to touch, yes, mesothelioma is an extremely rare cancer. So to your point, not to scare everyone that use the baby powder, there's less than 3,000 cases a year. But it is just make sure you're proactive and mindful about the disease and your use of these types of products. And I think that's, most of the history that we can cover, and helping everyone understands the harm that Johnson & Johnson has done to so many. Is there anything else that you want to touch on, Whitney?
No, just, again, I already mentioned this earlier, but just letting people know that talc is still in a lot of products on the shelf. So if you're shopping for any type of powder product, I would strongly advise, to just find an alternative. There's plenty of talc-free alternative products that are on the market that work great. So that would be sort of my parting words, is don't use talc.
Wonderful. And thank you. And if anyone has questions or would like any guidance about their exposure, about their diagnosis and legal help, you can give us a call. Our phone number is 833-628-8546. Or you can email us, and that would be patientadvocates@asbestos.com. So we hope you learned a lot about the ins and outs of ongoing Johnson & Johnson lawsuits and the potential dangers of talc-based powders. Thank you very much for joining Whitney and me and the rest of us at the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com in our first episode of the new podcast. After exposure, asbestos and mesothelioma stories. See you next time.